second session in a virtual masterclass for general practice receptionists and admin support staff. Life after lockdown and adjusting to the new normal. I'd like to start off by acknowledging the country that we're on today. I wish to acknowledge and pay my respects to traditional custodians of this land. I pay my respects to their elders past, present and future. I would also like to extend my respect to any Aboriginal or Torres Strait Islander people that may be here today. I'm your host for today. My name is Michelle Baxter, Regional Services Officer for Gippsland Primary Health Network. I support Latrobe and Bawbor LGA. Just got a few little webinar tips for today. Just like to ensure that your microphone is on mute and video switch on unless you're otherwise instructed. We encourage you to ask questions via the chat panel. This session will be recorded, so we ask that you do actually turn your video camera off if you do not wish to be part of this recording. Some Zoom tips. Please ensure that you have the correct name of the organisation displayed in the Zoom when you're joining the session. So you can simply right click on your image in the Zoom and select rename and then press OK. If there's some of you that have a few participants in the same room on the same Zoom logon, we encourage you to just enter your names into the chat so that you can actually receive a participation certificate for today's attendance. If you're joining from a smartphone or a tablet, tap the screen and select participant, find yourself in the list and then rename and click OK. Post-event information. So as we mentioned, the webinar will be recorded and a presentation and documents will be emailed out post-event. We will also be forwarding an evaluation survey, which will be emailed post-event, and we ask that you complete that within 24 hours. And then we will also receive a statement of attendance for your participation today. We've just put some information in the chat panel. We will be using the Menti app for live polls and feedback today. We encourage you to join and provide some really important feedback. So you can simply go to menti.com, enter the pass code, which is 5672690, and then answer the questions when instructed. As I mentioned, we have actually put that into our chat section as well. Okay, so today we're lucky enough to be joined by Brett and Maggie McPherson. They've recently relocated to the Huon Valley in southern Tasmania, a beautiful part of the world. And they've both spent time working in a large rural general practice in the Huon Valley and have been fortunate enough to escape the COVID lockdown in Victoria. Just some information about Maggie. She has 30 years experience in customer service, 15 of those in the health sector. She also held a manager as a practice manager at North Richmond Community Health Centre for the past 7.5 years. Maggie was also awarded the AAPM Victoria Practice Manager of the Year in 2015. Prior to her career in health, Maggie was an IT trainer and managed an 800-bed London hotel where she was responsible for training staff with great customer service. Just some information about Brett. So Brett also has experience in health management, including 14 years managing radiology practices and 16 years managing several different GP practices. Brett's currently working with a number of practices and organisations across Australia. Brett likes to promote adopting equality as a business strategy. Brett's a previous national president of the AAPM and has been a member of a number of government and professional advisory groups. including PIP, WIP, Medicare compliance and RACGP. I'd like to thank you all again for attending today. There'll be opportunities for questions throughout the presentation, followed by a Q&A discussion before we finish. Encourage you all to participate and ask questions, and yeah, I hope you enjoy the presentation that we have for you today. Thank you very much.
Hi, everybody. Now, hopefully everyone can hear me. And Michelle, you can see that on the screen. If you just nod your head, that's excellent. Superb. Bit of technical things as we get things all underway and ready to go. So now we're ready to move on. So thank you all for attending this afternoon. As you said, that along the way, there will be opportunity. We'll do a couple of Maggie questions. There'll also be an opportunity during Maggie's part around triage for people to share some of their experiences around triage. So we'd welcome you to become involved at that particular point in time, and perhaps I think, Michelle, I don't know whether you have to unmute them or they can unmute themselves, that would allow, but if they let us know, hopefully that participation will add to the presentation. So Michelle's given a bit of a background about us, and yeah, look, we were fortunate to move to Tassie just before the lockdown this year, and have been enjoying life down here without lockdown. So today is the second session. Last week we spoke about customer service and self-care. Today we're going to talk about triage and how we might be able to improve the performance of the team. So Maggie's going to be doing the triage. So I'm going to hand over to her now, and she'll be taking you through this session.
Thank you, Brett, and welcome everybody. As I said, I'll go through the triaging. Your participation would be really greatly appreciated. I'll start off by saying triage is not a perfect system, and everybody has a different experience and very varied. And having moved from Richmond, Victoria, where you had access to within a stone's throw of so many hospitals, to rural and remote, where people won't go to the hospital because it is so far away, your triaging is certainly far more challenging. So just a couple of things before we actually start getting into it. So I think one of the important things for the admin to know is, why is it so important? Why am I presenting to you about why triage is important? There's lots in the 5th edition standards that require the front desk staff to be the gatekeepers, the ones that are doing the triage, and be able to respond to any emergencies that come in. So those are them. I don't need to talk through them on the screen. If you want further details on those, I'll actually go to your practice manager and just get them to talk you through that. So the entire purpose of the triage is to ensure that the patient is referred to the appropriate level of care in the appropriate level of time. One of the things that I have put in here as well are some of the medical legal cases that are around issues that have happened around triaging. So the whole triage is assessing and identifying their needs to best ensure the outcomes and to with the least risk of an adverse event. And I think with that little cartoon, because yes, I certainly have had doctors that you leave patients waiting for 2 hours, and yeah, thankfully none of them expired, but there you go. Now, my first question to you all, and that Michelle did refer to the Minty, as did Brett. So just want to really ask you how confident you feel at the triage process within your practice. So as an entire team, not just the confidence that you have at the front desk level, but the confidence in your process from front desk, your clinical team. So I'll give you a couple of minutes just to jump onto Minty and put in that code. Now. Now, that was actually really quite pleasing to see that there was a number of people who felt really quite confident. That's not something I see a huge amount, so that's really well done for you guys. And if you don't mind, I hope of the people who did respond that there might be somebody who would be able to share some of their experiences. And again, it's always a reminder doing something like this. It's not like I'm telling you that what you're doing is wrong and here's the perfect way of doing it, because I don't think, it's always going to be something that needs to be continually reviewed and assessed as to whether it's being effective. So there's no right or wrong. It's just something that you have to work towards and what, as a team, you are comfortable with. So just again to go through, what is an adverse event, what is a clinical incident, and what is a near miss, and basically to go through what is it you actually really want to see within your practice. Do you want to see adverse events? Do you want to see clinical incidents, or do you want to see near misses? So an adverse event is any unplanned event that results in or having the potential to injure or result in injury of a client, staff, visitor to your property. Again, any adverse events, make sure that you have a process in place within your practice for actually reporting this, because that is also part of the accreditation standards. And if you have an adverse event, well, something went wrong with your triage process and you need to review it. A clinical incident is an event or circumstance that could have or did lead to an unintended. Again, so that indicates that something has gone wrong with your triage process and must be recorded, and you've got to try and put some, mitigate some of those risks. Now, a near risk is an incident that has the potential, but didn't either by chance, luck, or through timely intervention. A near miss should receive the same level of scrutiny as an incident that results in an actual injury. Again, what you'd like to see, well, you don't want to see too many of them, but your preference would be to see near misses within your practices, because there's an opportunity for you to learn before somebody actually does get harmed. So a couple of cases that I always like to refer to, and this just really, it does point to how important a role that the receptionist or the front desk staff have in the whole triage process. Because you're the ones on the phone, either on the phone, because most people will actually ring and say that they need to see a doctor urgently, so you've got to do that process, but we'll talk about that later on. So in this case of Alexandra and Heiss, what happened here is wife rings, makes an appointment for herself. During the conversation with the receptionist, mentioned that her husband had a headache and wanted to make an appointment for him to actually see the doctor as well. Now, at no point did the wife say it was an urgent or needed to be, the reception staff were not given an opportunity to do the triage process. When it did get to court, it was actually found that the receptionist had actually operated and gone in accordance with the policy and procedure. The case here shows that the husband died because he had an aneurysm before he could actually attend that appointment. When it did get to court, they discussed the processes. I always tell admin staff the policies and procedures. If you're not sure what your policies and procedures around triage, make sure you read them because they are there to protect you. So in court, the receptionist was found to not have breached her duty of care on this occasion. So that was a good outcome for them. I apologize in advance for the size of the font here, but I'll talk you through this. So this was and again, not necessarily a triaging issue, but more about making sure that you adhere to your process. One of the processes here is about making sure that you have an updated all the patient demographics in your software. So this patient had a test, was found to have actually had positive for HIV. In trying to contact the patient, the mobile details were out of date. The address details were out of date. So there was a delay in actually getting contact with that patient to actually let them know that they were actually HIV positive. But by the time they did get to advise the patient that he was HIV, or he or she, I can't remember which was, that they were HIV positive, they had actually gone on and infected other people. So you don't want that either. So you can read through that once you get a copy of the presentation about exactly how much. So it was a Bondi Junction. So the two doctors were, I think they had to pay legal fees of $745 plus 197 in court costs. So it can be quite expensive thing just for sheer little, and I know patients get annoyed that you ask them every single time that they come in if they only get their details changed, but based on these consequences, if you are comfortable with sitting in court explaining to a judge why you did what you did, well then fine, don't bother asking. But if you just have nightmares of the thought of actually sitting in a court trying to explain this, then for 20 seconds of asking that question, I think it's probably worth it. So this was an interesting one, which I had to re-look at this. So it does actually talk about the doctor's receptionist has a duty of care to assess the patient's condition and determine the urgency. So there is a court case that actually says it falls to the receptionist to make sure that the urgency has been assessed and the appropriate appointment being made. So nowhere in that has it mentioned anything about the nurse, the doctor. It's all on the receptionist. So that's pretty, I mean, I'm not trying to scare the living daylights out of you, but I just want you to understand that you've actually got a vital role. So don't let anybody underestimate how important a role you actually play in this. And as a manager, I'm always guided by the admin team because you're the ones sitting out there all the time. You're hearing it, you're seeing it. And if I do spend a lot of time out in the front desk, but if I'm in an office, well, I don't see what's going on. The nursing staff don't see what's going on either. So they're relying on you. And yes, so we'll talk a bit. So what do? You develop a triage system that works for your practice. It's not one that fits all practices because not all practices are identical. What you do need to do, and for those people who answered that were really confident in answering the question about as a team, because it's not just works on reception. It works for the entire team. It's what do the nurses want, what do the doctors want, and what's going to work in the best interest of patients. So develop your own systems. Now, the practice that I've just started down in Huon Valley, they've actually got 3 different types of triaging resources that they use. So one of them is called this pop gun. So they've got that plastered up on the back of their wall. They talk about it regularly, and they've got a couple. So have a look at what's out there and what's going to work. The only thing that I would actually say, I have actually seen one practice where they looked at this very black and white. So if a person didn't fit into category A, or then they moved to category B. There's lots of gray areas in the medical fields, and again, you've just got to agree with your team on what's going to work. So again, on the back of that pop guns, so that's the front part and that's the back. So it'll actually give you a really good explanation. It will be a really good guide to help you develop your own protocol. Again, What is your practice policy? Who does your doctor see immediately? Who do they see within 30 minutes, 30 minutes to 2 hours, sometime today, tomorrow, later, bookings in advance? So what do your general practice, do your GPs or your nursing staff prioritize? One of the things I'll actually say, and I think I can't remember if I speak about it later, but, and I think I do actually, it's you're reliant on your patients to be telling you, giving you correct information, which is a bit hit and miss sometimes. So the different types of triages that I've seen in my time is phone, face-to-face, and email. And the one that I hope nobody is doing, well, I don't know if it's changed with COVID, it'd be interesting to have that discussion, but I don't think email should be one of those methods of triaging, because emails are not something that we're always monitoring. We're too busy on the phone and dealing with people face-to-face to actually check the emails. So a bit dicey, that one. And again, I'm not going to be telling you anything that you don't know already. Is before you put somebody on hold, I don't like answering machines, because again, if you have, I have worked in a place where there was an answering machine and people were leaving urgent messages on answering machines, and these were on during the day. So if phones weren't answered, it would go to an answering machine. I think all general practices, the phones never stop ringing. So how do you get an opportunity to go back on the answering machine? With accreditation, you are required to ask a person if they are able to hold, which I think we all ask the question so really quickly that we forget to give them time to respond. We put them on hold before they've even answered. They'll probably need to just monitor that. This is where your investigative work starts. Like, what do you do? What are you asking? What do you know about this patient? And I'll come to that later, because some patients, as I said, are probably more risky than others. Well-known patients often create a bigger risk. And what I mean by that is actually twofold. And I was actually talking to one of the receptionists at my current, and what she was actually saying is that there are patients who don't want to be a bother. And if you say you're fully booked, and as I gave the example, there was a patient that I used to work with who didn't want to bother anybody. She knew how busy the doctor was, wanted to see a doctor that day, didn't get offered an appointment because she didn't say that it was all she needed to be seen today, or the question wasn't asked. When she eventually did come in and see the doctor was horrified, because she had fallen in the bathroom, hit her head, and was concussed. Now, we all know as a triage, that is right, come on down to the practice. But she never said that over the phone. So that's where I'm saying some patients can create a bigger risk. The other issue with some of the patients is you tend to find that they know how to work the system. So they will actually give you the answers that, so you might actually say, well, is it urgent? They'll go, yes. Well, what's the nature of the urgency? And they know the trick, they know the words to actually say. And the example I give there is how I got bamboozled. I was covering an after hours, and patient rings, clearly sounded very distressed over the phone, talked about, and particularly around mental health issues, felt very distressed, needed to speak to somebody, felt suicidal, and not having a mental health background. Well, what am I actually to do? She goes, well, and there was no nurse, so I told them to come straight down. When they did get into the doctor wasn't too pleased with me, because he only wanted a repeat script. So what can you do? Our hands are tied. We can only deal with the information that we were given. Yes. So who can help you make your decision? And I think this is where Brett it's challenging, because with your nurses being as busy as they are, who is there to help you with that decision? What I actually got into the habit of doing is, if I did triage and I booked somebody in, I always kind of checked in with the nurse afterwards and said, look, did I actually do that right? So it helps you be more confident in the decisions you're making and in the questions that you're asking, and you're constantly communicating about your processes. And again, where are you documenting your notes to help you make the decision? Now, one practice I know allowed the clinical or the admin team access to the clinical notes, and they actually had the whole triage questions put in there. So what the upshot of that was, or the benefit to them, is they wrote exactly, there was a whole series of questions that had been developed by the clinical team. The admin team would then just ask those questions, put in the answers that the patient actually said. So it's actually in the patient's record before they come down for the appointment, if you are deciding to make one straight away. The nursing staff then actually have a bit of an idea before the patient arrives exactly what the issue is. And then, you know, I certainly saw in action that what they say to the nurse is different to what they've actually said to the admin team, which we all know happens on a regular basis. So think about where we document and have quick access to help make your decisions. So this is what I developed. And again, in North Richmond, we had language issues. So 80% of our consultations were via an interpreter. So we had to keep our questions really basic. And this is what I'm saying, no one fits all. This is just with the doctor and then the nurses, this was the best we could actually come up with. So it's like making sure, again, because of all patients with very similar names, you need to make sure you get the right patient, firstly. Secondly, well, what's the nature of the problem? How long it's been? Is it getting worse? And have you seen another doctor about it? That was fine for us. But as I said, every practice will be different. You just need to be happy and confident that you're all singing from the same book. Now with triaging with COVID, there's also an expectation that we're triaging patients for COVID as well. And now that borders are opening up, certainly for us in Tasmania, we're starting to, you know, we haven't been as strict on asking all of these questions every single time patients come in, because nobody's been in or out of the state of Tasmania in nearly 100 days, I'd say. So the questions are irrelevant. So now with the opening of the borders, now we have to get back into triaging and getting better at it, I think is the word, because I've gotten a bit relaxed. And lots of people, certainly in Tasmania, are talking about how relaxed they've become. Now, apparently in Victoria, they are building a QR code. So this is all with the contact traces. I'm just referring to Brett here because he's more across this than I am. So that it's recorded where they are at any given time. Is that correct? Or I'll get Brett to talk to that.
Yeah, look, what they're doing is, and this has happened in the ACT and also New South Wales, is that you can develop and have a QR code at the front of your practice. Patients come in and they just do their QR code scanner or scan that code, and that automatically means that they can then be tracked should there ever be an outbreak or that kind of thing. So it's being developed in Victoria, and I believe they're following the New South Wales and ACT system, and it's an option that some practices and businesses have taken up that allows them to record patient attendance, as opposed you've got your own, I suppose, internal appointment books and that sort of thing. But this would then provide a central registry that, if in the event that something happened, then the Department of Health or that already have that kind of information. So it's on the way, and I'm sure that if it does come about, I'm sure the PHN will certainly be advising people of its ability and uptake and that sort of thing.
Excellent, thank you, Brett. So just go through a few case studies here. Now, we won't talk to them all. I think that there's the last one that I would invite some commentary. When I've actually done the good old days where we used to do this face-to-face, it was so much easier to actually ask the questions and get the answers. And mother of Stephen rings and he has a sore toe. You need to think about what questions should we be asking. So the one that I'm always interested in is, you know, nobody asks what age Stephen is, because once they say mother, they're assuming Stephen is a child. Stephen could be 27. So again, just think about what questions you should be asking. They're all manied and varied. How long? What color is the toe? Face-to-face triaging, I think, is far easier to do than the phone, because you can actually see the person, so you can actually see what state they're in. Is it urgent? How do you recognize if it's urgent? And what training is appropriate for you going forward? And I think all of you should be having regular conversations about triaging, and certainly what, not so much that it was training. Actually, well, no, we used to get the nurses and the doctors to come in and do training with the admin team on an annual basis. The only thing I had to be really careful of is I felt at times that the nursing staff and the doctors got too clinical. And I'm always very conscious of the fact that the admin team, it is not your role to be clinical. It is not your role to give clinical advice. And if I hear people giving clinical advice, I get really, really concerned, because guess what? That is not in your scope of practice. And if you do start giving out advice, and God forbid, a bit like that, the person who had an aneurysm or has a headache, and you're like, oh, go home and take 2 aspirin and give us a call in 3 days if you're not any better. If that ends up in court, good luck. So just be really, really mindful. And look, I found it interesting that the doctors and the nursing staff thought it was okay for the admin team to actually sort of delve into more clinical aspects. That's not what I'm there to do. What are the capabilities of your practice? So, and again, I think this is really, really important for a lot of the rural, because certainly some of the things that I've seen. So the practice that I'm at now is a very small practice. So if you can't have more than one medical emergency at a time, and considering where we are in rural, there's a lot. And I think in the previous practice, we might have had up to 3 medical emergencies at the one time. Now, it's not an acute setting, and you just have to figure out what are the capabilities of your practice? How many people can you realistically look after? It's a very tough thing to sort of say, sorry, you're just going to have to go to the hospital. Do you have a nurse? And I say that because depending on how large or small your practice is, or rural and remote, if a nurse is unwell and you've only got one nurse and they're unwell, well, back to previous point, what are the capabilities of your practice? Because if you've got no nurse, I would actually say if you've got no nurse, you should just be ringing 000 straight away. Now, disaster response plans, and I think there's a big call, and I think a lot of the PHNs have been putting out COVID response plans. But there's also, so that's your pandemic, that's your long-term plans. But there's also, what are you going to do? So the picture under the short term, that's really relating to short-term response plans, i.e. An asthma storm. What do you do as a practice if there's an asthma storm? There might be a couple of other things, but that's the one thing that actually comes to mind quite prominently. So issues arising for you, there's high versus low priority patients, but I think the patients themselves sometimes determine whether they're high or low priority. You've also got to, and one of the things I certainly noticed in Richmond, critically ill patients. So there may be patients who are really unwell. And what we used to get, again, put a note on the file, if this particular patient rings, the doctor determines if this patient is so ill that if they call, I will automatically see them. So there needs to be a note somewhere on the file that says, right, I need to see this person straight away. Infectious patients. I think in this day and age, and I think with COVID, I think we're all super aware that nobody's going to have this poster on their face or on their t-shirt saying, I'm infectious. Because it's taken as a given. Every single person that walks through your practice has the potential to be an infectious patient. Again, triaging aggressive patients. I've certainly had that as well, and it tends to be a lot around major mental health issues, and a really challenging one to deal with. So you need support from your patients. I mean, certainly I've had aggressive patients who basically said that if I don't get them in to see a doctor in the next 1 minute, that I would be personally responsible for their death and the death of their child. So, those are really harrowing things to actually have put on you. But nonetheless, I think we can all relate to that. What do you do and how do you triage? It's not just triaging the cough, colds, shortness of breath, the chest pains? What is your triage process for when you have infectious? And again, I'll give a good example of, again, in Richmond, because there was a butcher's just across the road, and the guy dropped the cleaver on his leg. So he just came across the road and walked the whole way through the practice, just sprouting blood everywhere. So it's what your plan is to actually clean and clean up the area as well, and your aggressive patients and patients you don't want in the surgery. So those would be the abusive patients. So again, what is your triage process for those? I've just kind of preempted, haven't I? So patient arrives with the surgery. I do this every time. I really need to put that at a different point so that I don't. So again, patient arrives at the surgery with a bleeding wound. I think with the very simple pop guns, that's a very quick decision. I think depending on how badly the injury is, it's what general practices tend to do is just really more patch and dispatch, really. And again, what the things that you need to consider are the infection control issues. I think in this day and age, with the issue with mental health, this is a really interesting case. Lecturer rings and says that they're sending a student who seems to be depressed. The student is from China, has not been to your practice before. They live alone. What do you do? And these are all things you should be going, just have a think. I mean, these are not actual cases that have actually ever gone to court, but the case studies are here to sort of just throw a couple of ideas your way about what interesting cases may have presented at your practice. So when you have your team meetings, and this is what I always say to my team, right, you know, if you had really struggled with something and you weren't sure how to triage it, take it to a meeting and discuss it as a group. And with that group, I'm actually talking, you know, if you do have a triage question, make sure that you might have one of your clinical team or your nursing staff in that meeting as well, so they can actually talk you through, like, what did you do, what were your struggles, and, you know, have you done it right? I always think anything with mental health is a very, very challenging one to triage. So make sure you have something in place for your mental health triage process, especially now with COVID. I think the anxiety levels are so much higher than they have ever been before. Another interesting one, following on from the asthma store. New patient arrives short of breath. She has asthma. She's got 3 children with her, and the children are upset and worried about their mother. So difficult one to triage here, because if they're asthma, you know, they're actually at the practice. That's not a case that you can actually turn them away. And that's the challenge I find with lots of places, is they're actually there. And you know, you actually have a duty of care, because, you know, if you send them away, the potential for harm here is quite high. I think, you know, part of the whole triage process is going, well, could this potentially end up being an adverse event, an incident, or a near miss? But what we also need to consider here is, how many patients do we actually have? Is it just the mother? Or are we actually talking about 4 patients, because we've an 8-year-old, a 12-year-old, and a 14-year-old that we also need to consider, because they're now anxious because they're seeing their mother in a lot of distress. And what do you have in place in your practice should you have that kind of a presentation? So what I'm actually saying should is, there's somebody that can actually take the children away into another room and occupy them, or, you know, try and comfort them in some way. But not all practices have the luxury of enough staff to be able to do that. So you just need to consider what you can do. And I'm just going to check on time, Brett. Yeah. Now, this is the one that if anybody is happy to unmute themselves and actually answer this, I would like to have a discussion, because when Brett and I used to do these face-to-face, it was always a very varied response to this question. So if you were the first person to arrive at the practice and you notice there is a patient slumped at the front door, what do you do? So you're meant to start at 8 o'clock. You're going to be doing the opening. So there's no nurse, there's no doctor, but yet there's a person slumped at the front door. What do you do? Looking for a volunteer who would be happy to answer that. Now, do I? Oh, hello? Have we got somebody? No?
That I can see.
Oh, okay.
If you're happy to provide feedback, you can just click unmute.
I guess in our practice, we've got a big front gate. So if they've made it through the big front gate and they're sitting at our front door, they're doing all right.
Good point.
Yeah.
From our perspective, we Dr. ABC, so the danger response airways breathing condition initially.
Yep. So I think what the message we really want to drive home here is do not open your front door until you have a doctor or a clinician inside your building. Do not open your front door. So if there is anybody who, and I think where I see this happen on a regular basis is you may have pathology companies that start at 8, but you officially do not start until 8:30. So some practices will open their doors. You could argue, and you need to speak with the pathology, are they prepared to assist in the event of an emergency? If they are not, well then, sorry, pathology, you're not coming in until our official opening hours. So it'd be interesting if any of you have pathology that open or are having patients in before you are officially, or your practice is officially open. Do you have anything to add?
Yeah, look, I was just going to say an interesting one here, and obviously when you have people giving back feedback, we can have a lot more of a discussion. But what I would suggest can be very difficult for you guys as reception admin staff, but I'd speak to your manager. And if they're a bit confused, I'd suggest that they speak to their medical insurer, because they can offer really sound advice around how you can actually do that. Because the whole thing comes back to a medico-legal area whereby if you open your doors and a patient comes in, there's an expectation that you're able to, or you have medically competent people there to actually provide care and service. So
yeah, you're saying you're ready to provide medical care.
So all I would do is if you do have an issue, I'd bring it up with your manager, and if they're concerned, suggest that they speak with their medical insurer, whether that's Avant or IMGA or one of those, but they can certainly provide resources and some advice on how to best handle that situation.
Thank you, Brad. Again, I revert back, and I actually said earlier on, now these are just examples. Make sure that you are looking at your policy and procedure manual. Make sure that everybody is singing, because I know that when we looked at the customer service last week, we were talking about the consistency of messages. I always loved at North Richmond, you just had to drill it into them about adhering to the policies and procedures. And there's always one that thinks that, well, they're medically trained and start giving advice to patients. But what I loved in the end is this culture whereby, like, if one member actually saw another person just not adhering to the policies, I sat there one day and I heard this person going, "Why did you do that?" Because Maggie has always said that, you know, that's not in our policies and procedures. And Maggie has always said that policies and procedures are there to protect us. So, you know, again, understanding what your policies and procedures are actually saying and making sure that the protocols and the procedures that you have, be it your pop guns or whatever you decide, actually match what is written in that policy and procedure manual. Look funny on the day of accreditation if your policy and procedure manual says something to what you actually do. And I'm nearly finished, but one thing to remember about triaging, it's never going to be perfect. Never. And it's like many things in life, because, you know, you can't have the perfect man, you can't have the perfect life. So because it's always a work in progress. It's a guide to your practice's capabilities, and those will constantly change. You have interns or medical students or registrars, so all of those things kept. Keep everyone doing the same thing. Again, making sure that you have that consistency. Make sure that you've got appropriate investigative work. What questions should you be asking? Again, talk to your nursing staff, make sure that you're asking the right questions. Stimulates awareness that the process needs to be taken seriously. Now, I hope that I haven't scared the living daylights out of you with those court cases, but I need to drive it home that it's a huge responsibility sitting at that front desk trying to make sure this is right. I know, and as I've said previously, you are reliant on the patients giving you the correct information. You're only as good as the information that you're given. And again, review it regularly and make it part of your QI activity. So it might be helpful because there's QI PIP. It might be something that you could actually use to help you with your QI PIP. Again, your primary health network would be able to tell you whether that would be something that would be available to do. Yes, and I think this is a good cartoon, which actually says being the worst makes you the first. Now I'll hand you over to Brett. Oh, is there any questions before I do hand over to Brett?
I haven't had any come through in the chat box, Maggie.
No problem. Excellent. So there you go, Brett.
Thanks for that. And look, I'd just like to reiterate what Maggie was saying there around your role as reception staff. You're not clinically trained. You're not fully medically trained. And it can be certainly extremely difficult, whereby you may have a particular query or a case, and trying to get hold of the nurse can be difficult because they say they're busy. But the thing is, you can't just brush that aside. You need to perhaps work out a solution that's going to mean that a priority with regarding to the triage of a patient is part of the nurse's role and job, and that they need to be able to have a system whereby they can actually take calls. I was in one practice where one of the processes that they used was that if the nurse was busy, they would just take the person's name and details and the nurse would phone them back. Well, unless you can be clinically certain of that case and that particular patient, then waiting for an hour or 2 hours for the nurse to phone back may actually be have significantly detrimental effects. So I think it's important that we do actually ensure that when needed, the nurses will take a call. And as Maggie said, if you've got a really good process in place, the nurses know that by the time you're calling them, you've actually gone through a basic process. You can give them the answers to those questions. And so it's a far more streamlined and an effective way to go. But a very important aspect and part of our daily lives. So I suppose this leads into our second topic of the day-to-day is around teams and effective teams and building teams. Because really there's going to be a requirement within your practice that you have an effective team. We've been online for about 45 minutes, so it's just a time to have a bit of a short break, and this is some really useless trivia information. The difficult things to do around counting hair, your eyes, and also your tongue. So no doubt everyone's got to put their tongue back in their mouth now because they've all been trying to breathe whilst they've had their tongue out. So effective teams, and often we look at successful teams, and partly because of, I suppose, our Australian nature and that sort of thing, we always tend to look at sporting teams and winning teams as being able to display that whole thing about what really makes them effective. And if you look at a number of those teams that, for example, there, I've just got on the screen, and you've got sort of the women's cricket team, the Autumn Foursome, netball, Indian cricket, and the All Blacks rugby. You think about, some pretty successful teams and what they do. And as an anecdote, and I'm a bit of a rugby tragic, but if we think about the All Blacks, there's a very interesting book that was put out and gave an insight into why they were so effective as a team, even to the point that at the end of games and training, they would, as a team, go around and clean out dressing rooms. But they would even go to that particular point of, as a team, making sure they even did the menial tasks, all wearing the same football boots and that sort of thing. So, it's really around different teams, and I suppose it's actually getting used to the fact of the different personalities. So we've had one of our mentee questions. What I'd like to ask you now is, if you're able to log on, would be, in a few words, what do you see? In a few words, 2 or 3 words, would be the characteristics of an effective team. So once again, if you log on to Menti and put in the code, you'll be given the opportunity to answer the question. I can start to see some words coming through there. And understanding, communication, processes. Good communication, sharing, job knowledge. I'll talk about that. I was saying to the guys at the PHN, this is a really, because presentation webinars are not having that face-to-face ability to communicate, this has become, I think, a really effective tool in allowing people to participate, so we can actually start to hear or see what people are thinking and that sort of thing. So, yeah, look, common goals, working well, direction, all really great points. I'll just give it another few seconds there if people are a bit slow and logging on and that. Look, and all really good feedback. So thank you for participating, sharing your thoughts. And it's interesting that I think pretty much every one of those items that you actually mentioned, I'm going to discuss at some particular point in the next 30 minutes or so. But I suppose if we look at why we have teams and what are a couple of key items around effectiveness within teams, I think an effective team actually drives success. So if you look at most really well-performing businesses or practices, they have some really good teams within there. You've got the whole practice team overall, but you'll also have those sub-teams and mini-teams and some, you know, I think the government call them tiger teams and that sort of thing. So we can't all be individuals and operate as individuals in a team environment. And I think that team, the ethic of it, supports the smooth running of the practice. The other thing which I think is really critical, and it follows on from Maggie talking about triage, it actually mitigates risk. So if you think about it, if you've worked in a number of practices, think about the difference between working in a practice where you felt part of a team and you've had a really high functioning team, as opposed to a practice where it might have been a lot of individuals or not really working together and very dysfunctional. You know, dysfunction, I think, means people aren't following things, so it can actually lead to risk. So what was it about that strong team that gave you the thoughts of things? And I think a lot of it was around that you actually felt that your colleagues supported one another. We actually worked together. So it was actually a shared working environment where you felt trusted and you felt part of the team. And if you did that and people had each other's back and looked out, then obviously there was a significant opportunity whereby you would actually mitigate risk. So I think 2 key drivers in teams, one is success and the other, it actually minimises the risk. You can go online and find out many variations of what makes effective teams or what are the great things or etc. I kind of like this analogy, and it's interesting, pretty much those 7 traits there were all covered in your feedback around that mentee thing. So as I think Maggie said, there's a copy of this is actually available. So there's some links to particular resources that you may find useful. So communication, and that was one of the ones that came through. Really good and strong teams, communication they have, and it's open. But people are encouraged to talk to one another. And you feel confident in talking to one another. And what I find sometimes about communication and that communication, I've used the word robust there. I can remember when I sat on boards and that sort of thing, and often one of the best bits of advice I was given when I started out was always think, or you can always be there to play the devil's advocate. So you can be discussing a particular item or a particular policy or something, or you may be looking at, how do we improve our triage system? But you'll find that if the majority of people all start agreeing and saying the same sort of thing, then I think someone needs to be able to say, but what about if this happened? And you play that devil's advocate. So you start to think about, how it might have gone wrong with that. And that then opens up the discussion. So you're actually getting pros and cons. And then often, as I said, on this board, we come to a vote and I would agree. And people say, but you just spoke against it. I said, but we need to actually consider the good and the bad. Things will happen. So that falls in that we can actually express our opinions freely. And don't be afraid to ask questions. I think providing they're constructive and they're done in such a way that actually is going to assist and help. We always say there's no such thing as a silly question, and there isn't. But I'm sure that you've probably been in situations where I think some people ask questions to either, ire the person or get under your skin or that sort of thing. And if that's the case, then I think that's where we've lost part of our effectiveness as a collegiate team. We'll get to that. Then communication, really important, but it's one of the hardest things to do. And I think as an overall practice team, to ensure that if as reception, and often there are a number of receptionists, even nurses or staff within a practice will be part-time. So if you're not there all the time, how do we ensure, or how does your practice ensure that you're kept in the loop? And that's where perhaps if a staff meeting happened and you weren't able to get there, don't be afraid to ask the next day that, what happened? Because I think if we can build on our communication and we can ensure that we are able to speak openly and consistently, that's where we build the trust. And that's one of the foundations of a really great team. We need to be collaborative. So we need to, in that, what I'm saying is that we need both within the group, individually and as a group, we actually take ownership of decisions made within the group. So we can discuss something, and it may be the policy around triage, answering phones, whatever. We're given the opportunity to talk about it and a decision is made, then we need to walk away from there owning that decision. We may not necessarily agree with it, but if that's the practice policy, that's what we've come up with, then we need to own that. As part of a team, you need to feel comfortable in the environment where you are. And this can then go to a whole lot of other areas. If you're not comfortable, is that because of intimidation, bullying, or a whole lot of other areas? So, and once again, effective team, you feel comfortable as being part of it. And we have a mutual accountability. We're not on a blame game. It's not, Mary's fault. It's not Stephen's fault. As a team, We're all accountable for what happens. Individually, we take our own accountability, and that's some of our individual will actually lead to that overall team. And our feedback's encouraged. So things like, and I'm using Maggie's talk from here about, near misses. If that's discussed as part of a team meeting, then we should be able to talk about that. So it's a regular item that we discuss. What happened to that near miss? How could we actually fix it? And if we have good teamwork, we have good communication, then we want people to give feedback. We expect people to give feedback. So it's, one thing I said, a bit of a rugby tragic, but if you look at like a rugby scrum, it's actually a combination of everybody together that actually makes it for a success. Teams should also have, or you require, some initiative. People heard me speak before. There's often a saying I use from Tony Robbins, if we always do what we've always done, we'll always get what we've always got. So unless we're prepared to show initiative and to change, be proactive, nothing will change. So we need to be proactive. And it's interesting that from a slightly different take, but from a business perspective and dealing with practices during this whole, the COVID and the pandemic, it was those practices who had a strong practice theme and were proactive that seemed to have actually emerged stronger from what happened during the past 6 to 8 months. Those that have actually been there, and look, we'll all complain about and we'll all have a bit of a bitch about all the issues that are going on, but it is what it is. We needed to do all of those kinds of things. We needed to ask the questions. We needed to have hot and cold areas in the practice. We needed to have people waiting cars. We needed to go into lockdown, etc. That was the fact. We couldn't change it. So those people that were actually accepted it and moved on and were proactive at how they could actually deal with that seemed to be the practices that succeeded best. We're proactive as opposed to being reactive. That doesn't mean to say that we can't be reactive, because we can't be proactive on everything. But we have to be, I'll talk a bit about flexibility, but we're proactive. We're trying to improve all the time. We don't always want to get what we've always got. We actually want to get better. We actually want to do things better. Better for our patients and better for ourselves within the practice, so that we actually really enjoy going there. We're seeking new ideas. We're improving on current ideas. Once again, going back to COVID, a number of years ago when I was working in Melbourne, and we introduced, this would have been about 2013, 2014, we actually introduced private telehealth, whereby, because we had a Japanese doctor, she had to go back to Tokyo every 3 months, so we actually introduced private telehealth. People were very sceptical at the time, but patients approved, they liked it, they paid for it. COVID has provided, and they've been talking about telehealth for years, and we've had this thing whereby general practice can do it, the specialists over a particular point in time. But what COVID meant was it actually happened quickly. It was bipartisan agreement amongst policy and politics. If we think about what's happened over the last 6 months or so in health, pretty much, guys, the politics has gone out of it. We haven't had all this political to and fro. Not that you would get that on the front desk, but it meant that things could change within a practice. So yes, it did mean we could use telehealth. So we had to actually come on board and say, well, how can we actually incorporate that? How are we going to improve? How can we make our telehealth better than someone else's? So it's always, it's not what happens to me, it's what I make happen. So if you can do those things, it can energize the group. So if you're always trying to improve and get better, be proactive, as a member of the practice or a member of a group, it's actually quite, I'd say energizing, but comforting and makes you want to be part and do things. We can be visionary. And part of being visionary, and this is where you guys really come in, is we actually have to understand how each of those daily kind of mundane things we do in the minutiae affects the long term and the big picture. So it's how effectively we answer the phone, take down details, put information that really starts to build. And if we can do each one of those incredibly well, to the best of our ability, the sum of all those little bits, and if we can improve on those little bits, will actually help us in the long term get to where we want to get to. If the practice has a plan, a vision, then hopefully there's some goals. There's hopefully some things that they actually want to achieve. And the successful practices who have good, strong teams share those goals with all the members of the team and all the members of the staff. There is no point in saying we want to be the best and we want to get there doing that, and the managers and the owners coming up with a number of strategies and goals but not sharing them. It's a bit like getting in a car and saying, you know, we're going to go to a fish restaurant in Melbourne. Well, which one? How? Etc. So you need to be able to, they need to actually vocalize and put down and share what their goals will be. And if we can actually understand those daily bits, and this can also be between parts of the team. So it's important that I think nurses really understand what reception staff do. Wouldn't it be great if all our GPs and doctors in our surgery actually really understood what happened at the front desk? Just think if they actually understood of what you go through, answering phones, dealing with people that, you know, on the phone, someone comes to the front desk, you've got them over the back of your shoulder going, can you please do this? They could just understand. So it's really being, you know, sharing and understanding how those daily bits affect it. And it's how we as within the team understand what other members are doing. I don't know that you're going to get doctors to come and spend time sitting at the front desk, but certainly I think if your practice has registrars, it's very useful, you know, if you don't already do it, but perhaps suggest to your manager or someone like that, wouldn't it be nice if one of the registrars could even spend an hour just at the reception desk to get a bit of, you know, rounded training as to what actually happens? Now, what that could mean is that registrar, you know, even 5 years down the track, will remember back to the time they actually put some time into reception. And so when they are seeing patients as a qualified GP, they actually remember, oh, actually, yeah, we got those things going back. So it may, you know, it's stuff that sits in the back of our mind and our subconscious. So building that. And if we do know where we're going, we can see what's happening on a day-to-day basis. We can actually start to anticipate what may happen if there's potential problems that may exist. And if we can anticipate problems, we can actually mitigate those problems. So it may well have been that if you know, a lockdown with COVID, and we seem to be using that, but it's topical, that in a particular state, for example, Tasmania, if there are going to be borders open and people coming, we may actually, as a practice, need to get some more PPE. We may need to get more face masks. So if the borders are opening in December, perhaps now we could actually be saying, we could say, you know, to your manager, do you think we might need some more masks and we can order those, or to the nurse, or so if we can kind of think and we're thinking about what's happening. And that's, you know, that just makes things happen better. It's You go into the really basic things, as I said, daily effects, you know. How often if you go in and you've gone to get a printer cartridge to replace a, you know, cartridge or a toner cartridge for a printer, and there's none there. You know, little things. Being part of an effective team is, and it may seem a bit far-fetched, but visionary. If you're taking the last or second last printer toner, let somebody know so we can order more to get them in. You've anticipated that. I mean, that's a really basic issue. But if you can anticipate it, order it, you've mitigated the problem. Makes it quite simple. And it can be as simple as that. It doesn't have to be big, highfalutin financial impact and things, but it's those daily items. You know, and when it comes round that you go to that and there's nothing, you think, oh, thank God it's there. You know? Yeah, that's because I made sure we ordered some. We've also got to be adaptable. We've got to be able to embrace change. We spoke a bit about before about being flexible, but you know, we thought that this year we were going to do X, Y, and Z. Well, I'm sorry, guys, 2020 has been a bit of a B, and C, more of an AAA, but we haven't been able to do anything. So we had to be flexible, change, do that. And if change is coming, we have to embrace it. I remember there was a woman in the UK, Helen Bevan, who heads up the NHS change thing. And one of her big common sayings is, you know, rock the boat while staying inside the boat. So, yes, there's going to be change and we're going to have to build things up a bit. And maybe sometimes as you know, you're on the front desk and at the front end and policies will change. Well, and you think, why the hell did they do that? Because of X, Y, and Z. But embrace it. Hopefully, if it's an effective team, you discussed it. But if it doesn't work, let's be flexible enough that we can actually talk about it, be proactive and discuss it, and then perhaps we could improve it so that it actually gets better. And those things will actually drive innovation. And I just put this up because you actually might be surprised that the one common thing about these 6 items here about Wi-Fi, cochlear implants, pacemakers, ultrasound, the HPV vaccine and spray on skin, all innovative, you know, pretty amazing inventions. They were all invented within Australia. So, you know, we're a pretty innovative nation in what we can actually do, and some of those are pretty far-reaching. So we also need to be, an important thing is you actually need to be constructive. And once again, if you go back to places where you may have worked that you haven't felt part of, or you've felt, you know, you've come home at the end of the day and, you know, kicked the dog, hit the husband or whatever, or abused and that sort of thing. It's part of it potentially may arise from the fact that we haven't been working in a constructive atmosphere. You know, we really haven't been in a practice focused on how can the team get better? How can we actually get better? And being part of a team is not about being yourself, boosting yourself, ego, self-importance. I don't think I need to say any more on that because I think the image says a lot and pretty much sums up about our the common story of self-importance. Really good teams are also organised. So we have defined roles. We know what we're expected to do. We've spoken about consistency of process, both this week with regard to triage. Last week we were talking about communication and customer service. And we've got good systems in the practice. We're trying to continually improve those systems. Systems are there, and if you go back to remember what I said at the beginning, they improve our service, but they also mitigate that risk. Not only do they protect the practice, but they also protect us individually, and they will be there to protect you, and they will protect you. You know, good teams we also measure our progress. And the other big thing is that I think, you know, one of the most effective, we actually make a decision. It's not procrastination, humming, oh, maybe this week, oh, maybe that, oh, I don't know, we'll do it next week. As I say to owners and, managers, saying no is making a decision. I'd rather have somebody say, no, we're not going to do it, than defer it for a month so we're not quite sure what's happening. Are we going to get a new phone system? Oh, I don't know, Either yes or no. So at least you actually know and can see that something's happening. But the main, I suppose, intricacies, what I think are really affecting the team. But I think it's also we have to have a bit of fun along the way. You have to enjoy what we're actually doing. And we can bring a bit of fun. And these are just over dealing with a number of practices, our different practice teams have actually brought a bit of fun into it. So, for example, we all have accreditation. We all have those surveys which we have to hand out to patients or get them to do that. So, some practices have had a competition as to which, if you have multiple reception staff, which receptionist can get the most surveys out and back from patients. Phone systems these days, you should be able to monitor, which station answered which call, so you can have an internal kind of challenge amongst each. When you start getting to the nurses and doctors, we start talking about care plan, GPMPs and team cares. Part of accreditation, it might be that we need to ensure that everybody's phone number's up to date or their address is up to date. May sound really mundane and boring, but if you go back to what Maggie was talking about earlier in that court case, we really should ensure that we do have up-to-date patient demographics and appointment booking. And then the other one, and the last one, is about knowing your colleagues, and that icebreaker bingo is a really good thing that can actually be used as a bit of fun, at staff meetings. So, but I find pretty much with most challenges that you may have as a team in practice, that generally chocolate or wine works pretty well as rewards for weekly or monthly or whatever you want to do winners. And it can be as simple as, each day someone gets the Freddo for the most. So once again, it's a bit of fun. So what about teams in our practice? So within our practice, we have all these variations or variances of different people. So we've got registrars, you've got doctors, you've got managers, you've got allied health admin. So for you, you're going to have a team within that role. So your particular team will be your reception and admin team. And you'll spend a lot of time in there, very specific to how you're actually working within your role and your position description. But you're also part of a much wider team. You're part of the whole practice. So, for example, when they start talking about how we're actually going to manage chronic disease, patient coordinated care, we're actually going to have to start to get people from each of those areas. Someone from admin, a nurse, a DP, the manager. And if your practice doesn't include somebody from admin or reception, then I would be proactive and talk to the manager and say, do you think it might be a good idea, or have you considered incorporating one of the team or the reception team as part of that team? So we're proactive. We're actually saying, we've got things because we're there. We see the patient. We deal with them. We actually know the process. So, and being constructive in saying, have you considered or do you think, as opposed to you must or you need to, will probably have a better result. And if you remember back to last week, Maggie was talking about customer service. We have to ensure, or practice should ensure, that all staff are aware of all the services and strategies. And I noticed that was one thing that actually came up when people said what makes a good team, and people were talking about knowledge and knowing services, because often the front desk, admin, reception staff are actually not forgotten, but perhaps overlooked a bit when they start talking about particular areas around chronic disease or that, or we're bringing in a new service and they make all these wonderful things, but actually forget to tell the people who are going to answer the phone that we're actually introducing this service or what that service actually means. Yeah, Maggie just said, or you've got a nurse who's very proactive and decides that they're actually going to send out all the recalls and reminders today. So all of a sudden your phones go berserk, and you haven't been told. Or they do it at 10 o'clock in the morning, which is your busy time, instead of perhaps 1:30 or 2 o'clock when it's a quieter time. If you actually got together and spoke about it, it becomes easy to say, well, look, instead of sending out 100, what about we send out 20 today, 20 tomorrow, and that sort of thing. So, excuse me, once again, simple stuff that can have a really significant bearing on our workload. And it's just better if a patient walks in and they can actually talk to front desk and that person knows, that we call it superior product knowledge. They actually know about the practice and the services. That's a really positive experience. And it also, for those less confident staff at the front desk, they can actually see it, and it starts building confidence amongst the team that everyone can start saying the same thing. Drawing to, coming towards the end, but I think some of the things that we've actually experienced over COVID and the pandemic is that it's actually changed the way that we've delivered health. And it's changed the way that I think our workplace is going to operate into the future. And that has significant impact on the effectiveness of our team. So if you think about the last 6 months, and if you were working from home, and the example of the practice down here in the Huon Valley was that they may have had 6 or 7 receptionists. You'd have 3 or 4 working on one particular day across multiple locations, and they would always be there on site. But if all of a sudden you're down to 1 or 2 reception on site and everybody else is working from home, how do you actually maintain the communication between staff? And the other thing too about fun and communication is, and I'll just say, the rapport between your team. And one of the examples I give you there is that I said when I was on boards and previously, as boards, you would come in the night before, you would get to know members of the board, have the board meeting and go. This day and age, you either come in via Skype or do it in the day and out via Zoom. So you don't really get to know the people in your team. So you can actually lose that rapport. And whilst it doesn't, go over and above, but often you will hear between staff talking about, hobbies that they do, what they like, what they do on the weekend. So that's building the rapport, providing it doesn't overtake the work. And you have patients walking in and they're still talking while patients are waiting at the desk. Social interaction, that's going to be a real issue with, to ensure that we maintain that. We're human beings, we need that interaction. And we need to have that message consistency, so that everybody gets the same message and everybody is doing the same thing. Because whereas if you have 2 or 3 receptionists sitting across your reception desk talking on the phone, other people can just give them a nudge and say, oh, did you think, or you shouldn't have said that, or, if you're at completely separate, isolated stations, i.e. at home, that can be difficult. So to summarise, yes, there's teams, but all teams need successful team members. So what do we actually need to be? We actually have to have respect for the people there. We have to have a belief in where we're working. We need to be professional in how we work and participate, be part of the team, actually get part of it and comply. We actually have to follow the rules and be there. So a couple of things in just quickly that summing up, I suppose, the last 2 sessions for reception staff. We call them the 10 commandments, Be consistent. Communicate. You should try wherever you want, only do it once. Do it well, but do it once. Take ownership of the issue that's there. Ask questions. Don't rely on secondhand information. Don't rely on that he said, she said scenario. We're actually going to commit to the team. And whether it's politically correct or not, sometimes we actually need to, as Maggie often says, we need to take a teaspoon of cement. We just need to harden up a bit, Doesn't mean we succumb to bullying or that sort of thing, but sometimes things are not personal. Be the point of difference in the practice. If everybody's the point of difference, imagine what that does, Have a go. Embrace your software and technology. And the final one is that we live with it, we seek to change it, or if we don't seek to change it, we end it. So especially on Teams, and Ken Blanchard, who is the 1-minute manager, I think that's a really telling comment. None of us is as smart as all of us. So that's really been about the teamwork and the triage. Thanks, everyone, for your participation. Thanks for listening. We've got some time for some questions. Hopefully you've found the last 2 weeks useful and beneficial. And my thought is that, if we can take 1 or 2 things away, we've done really well. So,
Thanks, Brett. I haven't got any questions in the chat box.
Yep.
Just like to remind everybody that if there were more than one staff member joining on the login, if you could just enter additional names into the chat box so that we can make sure that everyone receives a certificate of attendance. I flicked through a question, Brett, just earlier. There's often situations where you could have a receptionist that has a nursing background, and where we were sort of talking about, not giving advice, sort of having that clear distinction between the 2 roles.
Sure. My default response to that would be, are you employed as a receptionist? Are you employed as a nurse? If you, I've had a scenario where there's been a receptionist that's training as paramedic. Now, starting to give advice. If your position description says that you are employed as a receptionist to do X, Y, and Z, then you need to be very, very careful that you don't overstep that mark and go into clinical advice, because it may well be out of the scope of what you're employed to do.
It would make them very good at effective triaging, but they've got to be very conscious of their scope of practice.
Yeah.
Often what's happened, and having done work with Avant, and the thing that they often say is that if you're put up onto the witness stand, and the thing is that are you clinically trained? And they may say, in this particular, they might say yes or that. The thing then comes, well, what does your position description say? Does it allow you to do that? No. And often it'll come back to the process of what is actually in your, as I said, within your scope and practice. And as Maggie said, yes, it can be very useful because you're probably a bit more confident in the triage process, but it's actually giving out clinical information that can actually be...
Yeah. Brett, we just had a question come through from Fiona asking what was on the last screen. Live with it, change it, or what?
End it.
End it.
I can go back. Basically what there, and I suppose it's a nice way of saying that you know, if we're working in a practice, and this is the policy, and this is what's happening, we can either follow it, which we should.
Mm-hmm.
We can try and change it, as in teams, and we can discuss it. Or if we don't like it, then we're not forced to work there. We have the option to basically say, well, look, I'm not going to work in this environment because I don't agree with it for whatever reason that may be.
Yeah, perfect. Okay, well, I haven't had any other questions come through. I'd like to thank you all for joining today. If you've got any questions, please reach out to us at Gippsland Primary Health Network. And I'd just like to take this opportunity to thank Brett and Maggie for the session today and for the session last week. I participated in both and found them both very useful. So thank you.
No problem.
Thank you. And
Thank
as you
you.
said, with copies of the our emails are there, and if people have questions, we're more than happy to answer email queries if people want to send them through.
Yep, perfect. So we'll provide copies of the first and the second session as well. That's great. Just getting a few requests to coming through about receiving last week's information.